Hello and welcome to The World Today. I'm going to discuss India and recent developments in India with Professor Jairus Banaji, who is a research professor at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, but who of course has spent large parts of his life in India itself, working, lecturing, teaching, analyzing, and is a well-known intellectual of the Indian left. India, when people talk about it, is usually seen in the image of those who defend the Indian state uncritically as the world's largest democracy, which is of course true, as a country in which liberal democratic institutions have existed continuously, with the exception of 3 or 4 years during an emergency since the country became independent in 1947. And unlike its neighbors, it has not been under a military dictatorship or an extreme authoritarian government till very recently, when even the authoritarian regime in power was actually elected, albeit with a minority vote, which is the way in which the Indian electoral system works, and it unfortunately and is not very democratic, but never mind. Historically speaking, that picture is not inaccurate. So the question now arises, with the troubles in different parts of India continuing, with the recent occupation and semi-uprising in one of its more recent universities, the Jawaharlal Nehru University, JNU, where students were arrested, taken off to prison, thus provoking a huge response both in JNU, in other Indian universities, and of course many parts of the world. So we've got Jairus Banaji in the studio today to discuss with us what actually is going on in India. What is the Congress Party? What explains the huge defeat that this traditional ruling party in India suffered? Whether this party could make its way back? What is the social and mass basis of the far-right group, the BJP, and its mother organization, the RSS, which was set up in the 1920s, in governing India today? Jairus, welcome. Very good to have you. You were, of course, a student at the Jawaharlal Nehru University yourself. And when the university was occupied recently, you, together with others, went and spoke to express your solidarity. Why do you think this spark at the JNU attracted so much attention at home and abroad?
Well, I think it's worth starting with something you referred to, which is the somewhat contradictory nature of democracy in India, which is that it has, on the one hand, enormous reserves of resilience, thanks to a kind of democratic constitution, but on the other hand, it's also severely limited by the authoritarian nature of the state in India. Now, this sounds paradoxical to say that we have a kind of resilient democratic culture in the country, but one which is limited by an authoritarian state. What I mean by that is that the state machinery, the kind of apparatus of the state in a hardcore sense, has largely ring-fenced itself from the intrusion of the law and of constitution, of constitutional democracy. And the most striking expression of this is the rule of the military in large parts of the country, namely in Kashmir
and Manipur.
And the large parts of the northeast as well. And the fact that you have this raging counterinsurgency in the heart of India, in central India. So on the one hand, you have a kind of fairly authoritarian state, in the sense that it's a state that's largely immune to legal intervention and political intervention. AFSPA, as it's called, the kind of Armed Forces Special Powers Act hasn't been removed by the previous government, despite pressure to do so, because the army countermanded it and said they weren't willing to do without it. So, the constitution of India is in some sense the symbol of its democracy. And it's interesting that this narrative plays out in the JNU crisis in a central way, because Kanhaiya, the young student leader, or one of the student leaders who's been most vocal and articulate in this crisis, repeatedly refers to the constitution.
कोई दुर्भावना नहीं है, क्योंकि हम लोग सच में लोकतांत्रिक लोग हैं। सचमुच का संविधान में भरोसा करते हैं। संविधान में, इस देश के कानून में और इस देश की न्याय प्रक्रिया में भरोसा है। इस बात का भी भरोसा है, पूरा भरोसा है अपने संविधान पर। पूरे तरीके से खड़ा होते हैं अपने संविधान के उस तमाम धाराओं को लेकर जो प्रस्तावना में कहा गया है। समाजवाद, धर्मनिरपेक्षता, समानता।
It's the symbol of our democracy, of its resilience, just as the army in the background, so to speak, is the symbol of an authoritarian state that has largely insulated itself from both civil society and political pressure. So you have a kind of conflict or a contradiction at the heart of India's democracy, which is that it's alive and kicking, but it's also being progressively undermined, both in the gradual sense that it's being undermined over decades by the imposition of military rule in parts of the country which India is trying to kind of forcibly integrate into Indian democracy. The emphasis there is on forcibly integrate. But on the and also in the more immediate sense that we see authoritarian forces now actually ruling the country in a more direct way. I think, just for clarity, it's worth disentangling these two aspects, which is the authoritarianism of the Indian state and the problem of fascism. They aren't quite the same problem. You had an authoritarian state under Congress. You still have an authoritarian state today whose powers are being magnified in some sense. But I don't think, with the exception of very small sections of the left, anyone would characterize rule under Congress or the Congress party itself as fascist.
No.
As having anything to do with fascism. That's a kind of classic third period line.
Yes.
And I think it's wrong, basically, that line.
But let's come to the Jawaharlal Nehru University. This was a postgraduate university set up with great fanfare, a model university in many ways. I remember when we were young, I mean, you were a student there and I often visited. And the atmosphere, the debates were vigorous and sharp, and sometimes with the more Stalinist groups bordering on semi-violence, but it rarely broke out. There could be a discussion. And the educational level, Jairus, was pretty high. When you look at the caliber of Romila Thapar, Bipan Chandra, many others, I don't want to mention too many names, the quality of education provided was very high. And of course the rest of many people in other parts of India, you've been to the Oasis, of course, you're happy. But it was an important and still remains an important institution. So why do you think the government decided to provoke this crisis by arresting the student leaders?
Well, JNU has always been a bastion of the left.
Yeah.
And I mean the far left. In a sense, the unique thing about JNU is that the culture of sectarianism that often characterizes the left worldwide doesn't exist in JNU. It doesn't exist in the campus. There's a kind of let 100 flowers bloom kind of philosophy that prevails, perhaps implicitly.
Yeah.
You won't have left groups attacking each other. They will compete vigorously in the student elections, obviously, but that's part of a kind of electoral process, that's part of a democratic process in university. And so you have a united left in JNU. Now, the context to understand the recent attack, the one that dates from February, from roughly about almost 2 months ago, is a general drive on the part of the BJP's student organization, the ABVP as it's called, to penetrate, control and dominate all the major campuses in the country. And obviously the resistance to that is going to be strongest where the left itself is fairly well organized and cohesive, as it is in JNU. In JNU we have a remarkably mature left student population. Not only is it intellectually sophisticated, but as I said, it's organizationally on the whole united. There are no divisions within it. They don't squabble among themselves and so on. I think the context in which to understand the attack on JNU is this whole agenda that the RSS and the BJP have of trying to dominate the institutions of higher education in the country, which itself is part of a wider agenda of controlling the commanding heights of Indian democracy in some sense.
It's their version of the long march through the institutions.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's exactly what's happening. Not only has there been a kind of deep penetration of the state apparatus, of that kind of hardcore apparatus that I referred to, gradually over the years and over the decades, but now there's an overt assault on institutions which are not within their control. And so, for example, all the major educational and cultural institutions in the country have to now come within the ambit of the RSS and its direct control. They can't fight this battle hegemonically, since Hindutva as their form of hegemony won't work in kind of relatively sophisticated sites like university campuses. So they have to do it by force, so to speak. Behind that agenda itself stands the more wide-ranging agenda of just dominating the country politically to the extent possible, which is what's going on in all the in the various states.
Politically and culturally.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
And you know, you say that they haven't achieved full hegemony. This, of course, is thankfully true. But their project, when you look at it from the 1920s onwards, consciously or unconsciously, was a slow penetration of the country on every level, total break, though often not expressed in public, with secularism, the nationalist tradition established by Gandhi and Nehru, with all its weaknesses that we know, but still it was established. Yeah. And a break with all that couldn't be said publicly, especially if your organization had participated and organized the assassination of Mahatma Gandhi. That made it a bit difficult, but they recovered. They recovered relatively soon after Gandhi's assassination. They were not particularly ashamed of it in their private conclaves, etc., and they carried on. And there is a way in which they have done in India, though they haven't completed the process, which the left was never able to do, certainly. No section of the left. And it's a project which Gramsci, the great Italian theorist and thinker, once did describe very vividly in gaining these institutions intellectually, politically, culturally, and then you almost have the country in your lap. They haven't got it as yet. I agree with you, but the possibility that they could, because for them really, participating in elections and participating in liberal democratic institutions is important because they have to run the country, but it's not as important as people imagine. Yeah. Because it's the RSS, the mother organization of all these different front organizations, including the ruling party, that is now dominant, and that has no parliamentary position as such.
Absolutely. I think it's worth pointing out that the RSS has strictly fascist origins, going back to the late 20s.
Yeah, they identified with fascism.
But it's a fascist movement that has had to adapt to the strength of Indian democracy, so that it's an extra parliamentary opposition
from the right
to democracy, which cannot actually abolish democracy all in one go, so to speak. And there is a widespread, wide-ranging project to undermine the key institutions of Indian democracy in some sense and sap its kind of inner strength. You're right about the RSS recovering rapidly in the 1950s, but it's actually the 1980s that formed the watershed to the rise of the BJP as a mass party. And it's worth maybe asking why, because I think 1984 was a crucial watershed. Now recently, Kanhaiya made a speech which provoked a huge public backlash, at least in the social media. And he claimed that there was a qualitative difference between the violence against the Sikhs in 1984 and the violence against the Gujarat Muslims in 2002. He may not have expressed himself very well, but I think what he was driving at was the following, which is that we had mass crimes in both situations, against the Sikhs as well as against the Muslims. These were well organized. There was considerable planning behind both episodes of violence, and there was a degree of state complicity in both episodes of violence.
Without any doubt.
Right? That's the crucial thing, that you might want to describe this as state-led pogroms in both cases. It doesn't particularly matter what words you use. The important thing is that there was state complicity in 84 as there was in 2002.
Without any doubt.
Yeah. The difference, I think, that Kanhaiya was trying to drive at, he may not have expressed it very well, was that the violence in Gujarat was part of the long-term agenda of a fascist movement in the country. It would be hard to argue that the violence against the Sikhs in 1984 belonged to this sort of a longer-term agenda on the part of the Congress Party. I mean, that's the crucial difference, that the meaning of the two sets of events, political meaning of the two sets of events is rather different, which is not to minimize the horror and the ghastliness of what happened in 1984. In fact, there is a direct link between the 2 years, which is that because the Congress leadership refused to prosecute any of those elements of its own party who were actually directly complicit in the violence in 1984, a new culture of impunity, of political impunity, grew up in the country. And it's that culture which has shielded the BJP and its communalization of politics since the 1980s. It's also fueled the expansion of the BJP. So there's a sense in which Congress and what it didn't do, its sins of omission, are directly responsible for the rise of the BJP and the fact that it's actually...
the Congress couldn't do that, Jairus, because some of the people involved in the massacre and pogroms of Sikhs in Delhi, I know because I went there very soon after that, people were openly boasting about it at private dinner parties, and they included central leaders of the Delhi Congress. So for them to be punished when they had actually, by themselves, for organizing this, whether Rajiv Gandhi gave his authorization or not is another question. But certainly they carried it out and they acted on his behalf.
Yeah, sure. So the key point is that, in a sense, 1984 came to legitimize the use of mass violence in Indian politics. And in a sense, it's a strategy that was specifically associated with the BJP and the RSS, but it's a strategy which Congress allowed to emerge in Indian politics.
Yeah, we could actually, in fact, go even before that in terms of sending in the army to occupy Kashmir, carrying on that occupation decade after decade, getting worse and worse as that occupation went on. The bloodbaths in Hyderabad soon after partition, the occupation, the military occupation of the Northeast with astonishing events in Manipur, where there was one of, I think, the most amazing demonstrations I have seen from afar of women from the age of 80 to the age of 10 or 11 stripping themselves naked and standing outside the Indian military base and saying, "Here we are, come and rape us." I mean, what could be more effective than that? And yet it went on and on and on. So I think, you know, what you call the authoritarian segment of the Indian state has been in action right from the beginning. And
let me try and sort of draw attention to another aspect of this, which concerns, if you like, civil society, which is that you do have a large working class in the country. I think maybe 70–75% of the population would be wage laborers or salaried wage earners, but you do not have an organized working class in India. You did have pockets of organized working class militancy in the country down to the 70s and 80s, but then much of that was smashed. So what you have today is a very large mass of working people, of the working poor, who are actually denied rights of organization which they're entitled to. And it's that aspect of the Indian state of turning a blind eye to the rights which people are entitled to under the constitution, which constitutes the other aspect of authoritarianism in Indian society. And that, of course, ties in with caste, which is that in many respects, caste is the backbone of Indian society. Even though it's a capitalist society, and in some respects it's a fairly advanced sort of capitalism, it's increasingly being globalized since the 1990s and so on, as you know, with Tata's pulling out of British steel, this British steel industry. Still, there is a sense in which this seemingly traditional institution of oppression, of hierarchy and oppression, remains the backbone of Indian society, of Indian culture, and of the Indian economy, because it's impossible to disentangle caste from all those other areas of society, such as economic relations, family relations, and so on and so forth. Now, about specific...
Hang on, before we move forward on from there, let me ask you why, in your opinion, do you think that Indian capitalism, which actually has been very dynamic, and even during the days of the British rule of India, Indian capitalists were growing. Independent Indian capitalism was growing and being incubated during those days. So it is, and especially in certain parts of the country, it's been very, very vibrant. Why has this powerful, vibrant Indian capitalism not been able to sweep caste aside? Why does it respect the caste system inside factories, etc.?
Well, I mean, the danger in responding to this would be a sort of crude functionalist explanation, which is that it's somehow in the interests of Indian capital to keep the caste system alive. I think the answer simply is that these are segments of Indian society which are not within the control of any kind of not within the control of capital, so to speak. I wouldn't go along with a kind of reductive and conspiracy-based kind of explanation.
But it's just a fact.
Yeah, and I think there is currently a kind of strand of research and debate, among academics about what is it that keeps institutions of caste alive. I think it's required in some sense by the nature of Indian society, which is that caste is a kind of more immediate and palpable embodiment of the oppression of the poor in the country. So that, and it's very hard to separate class and caste, to say that they're two different sorts of things or two different sorts of structures. The fact is that the Indian left has never taken caste seriously.
No, this is absolutely true.
The mainstream left, the big parties and so on, have never taken caste seriously. They've never integrated it into their politics, either intellectually or politically. And that has allowed a space for the emergence of purely caste-based political formations like the BSP, that's Mayawati's party. But that itself is a symptom of a wider crisis of the left, which is the lack of any political imagination on the part of the left parties. I mean, India is a society which is crying out for solutions of various sorts, and none of those are coming from the left parties. There is even a sense in which the BJP has been able to fill part of this space because it projects itself as a party that wants to modernize the country. Now, of course, this is not a real modernization of India because they are not committed to a secular country, to a secular society and a secular state. On the contrary, they're part of an agenda to undermine those aspects of the Indian state. But there is a sense in which Modi constructed a narrative about modernizing the country and repositioning it in the world as a kind of modern global power and so on. As I say, it doesn't have deeper political and cultural underpinnings, but it's a space vacated by the left, which is that the left has never spelled out a vision of the kind of India it wants to see. It's always reacted to the new economic policies of 1991 and always suggested that it wants to go back to something which is pre-1991, which is a utopia, because it can't go back to something which is prior to the economic reform program of the 90s. The ground on which it needed to situate itself was precisely what was happening, the transformations that were occurring in the economy and in society, but it didn't do that. It refused to do that.
But Jairus, the result of all this is that we have, I think for the first time, if the figures I read are correct, a situation where the far right's student representation on campuses is much, much larger than the left and the Congress and other groups put together. That they've, in fact, leaving aside JNU, more or less captured a majority of Indian universities where their ideas are popular and their groups are thriving.
Well, it's not totally surprising given that even in the trade union field, the largest union for quite some time has been the BMS, which is the BJP's trade union. So, I mean, if even in a constituency like the working class, the organized working class, the most right-wing of the trade unions can actually capture the largest membership, it doesn't surprise me that at certain levels of the higher education hierarchy, the ABVP might actually muscle its way into capturing, because student elections today are fought with, basically with money power. A lot of muscle and money power is involved in, for example, the elections in Delhi University some time back. So that's not surprising. I think the issue for the left is how is it going to reinvent itself, given the crisis that the country is facing, that the left itself is facing, that a centrist party like Congress is facing.
It is a global problem. I mean, it's not just
sure,
India.
Absolutely.
You know,
but
here one has to put India in the context of the world situation as well.
Sure, absolutely. I agree with that. But on the other hand, what's in some sense exceptional about India is that the Communist parties never chose to rename themselves or relabel themselves.
And they were mass organizations.
They remained in some sense unreconstructed, and the one consequence of that unwillingness to rethink revolutionary politics in the conditions in which it requires to be rethought is that they're today facing a major crisis of extinction, I think, as national parties. I mean, they may continue to survive as regional bastions here and there. Yeah. But coming back to the BJP and this link which I suggested earlier between the kind of culture of impunity that emerged in the 1980s and the use that was made of it by the BJP political leaders, both in the 90s and then in the 2000s, in successive rounds of communal violence in various parts of the country. To my mind, suggests a very serious breakdown of India's criminal justice system. So there is a sense in which the burden of this falls onto the judiciary itself, which is that if we have a judiciary in the country which is repeatedly compromised by politicians and by political interference, which cannot think for itself in terms of fairness and justice, which cannot think for itself in strictly legal terms, then effectively the criminal justice system ceases to exist. So it's quite alarming that practically no one has been punished for 1984, and the only people punished for 2002 are small fry, with the singular exception of one member of Modi's cabinet, Gujarat cabinet, which is this Maya Kodnani, and even she's been let out on bail now.
But why should the judicial system remain immune to the changes in the political culture sweeping the rest of the country? I mean, this you can see the last time one really admired the Supreme Court of India when they took quite a number of controversial decisions was in the late 70s, I think, or even early 80s. And then slowly you began to see the decline. And that is not so different from what is happening to the Supreme Court in the United States.
I suppose the point is that the rule of law, quote unquote, is the backbone of our constitutional democracy. Yeah. If it ceases to function, there's a real sense in which democracy isn't functioning either. So I kind of want to, squarely put the emphasis on the judiciary in the country and the need for it to retain its independence, to retain its autonomy, and the need for it to recover a sense of being able to think independently and critically. Mass crimes have been repeatedly committed and hardly any punishment, hardly any justice has been doled out.
Thanks very much, Jairus. This is a fascinating discussion. And it's so fascinating that we're going to carry it on next week as well.